Sitting just south of Columbia along 321, it's just a small crumb off of the misshapen piece of pie on the United States plate that we call South Carolina. Its population has almost never gone down over 2,000, and it is only 3.4 square miles across in all directions. It feels even lonelier when you come in from a place like Virginia. After Mom lost her job, we moved to the only place where the rest of our family resided. Good old South Carolina. I had been moping on the trip the whole time on the way down here. The way I saw it, the only friends I were going to make were fire ants in that inferno of a sun. Once we got settled in at 304 Dixiana Drive, I immediately set out into the neighborhood in search of friends. I didn't know how to ride a bike at the time, and I barely knew how to ride a skateboard. So I petered down a long stretch of road directly across from the front of my house on my cheap little warm-up board until I came to a small cul-de-sac that seemed to go uphill. Sitting outside on his front porch was a chubby kid with glasses. He looked about 10 or 11, about my age at the time. I really had no one else to talk to, so I asked what his name was, and he told me that it was Terry. He liked being outside a lot, and I didn't, but we both seemed to like video games. With that, we would get along just fine. There was one thing that he hadn't told me over the next few weeks that we spent riding around the neighborhood. He was into scary movies. I was a massive coward when it came to anything that seemed intent on forcing you to change your underwear every 5 minutes. So I didn't really like this aspect of him. Even worse, he had tons of horror movie action figures and loads of VHS tapes of all the creepy movies you can think of stacked in his room. Every time I came to visit, he was almost certain to scare the living bejesus out of me with one of those creepy Freddy Krueger dolls, or force me to watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with him. His room wasn't really that nice looking to begin with. He had a bunk bed, even though he was an only child, in which he slept on the bottom, and all his slasher flicks and action figures slept on top. There were loads of holes in the walls, and everything had a generally grimy feel to it. It made those horrifying moments of watching pure terror in the dark all the more icky. One day, when he realized that I pretty much hated any kind of horror movies he threw at me, he began telling me urban legends. Some of them were about the town as a whole, but more than that, they were about our particular neighborhood. I didn't really believe any of them. That is until he told me about Hanging Man Hill. It was about a year after we had met each other, and we were riding around the neighborhood. By this time, Terry had told me to man up, and he eventually taught me how to ride a bike. He stopped when we were riding in front of a house we had simply entitled the Crack Shack, due to its residents being stoned out of their minds on a daily basis. He seemed to be peering out at a small pathway behind the place that went up the further you went back. He was usually the leader when it came to showing me new places in the neighborhood, so I didn't question a thing when he beckoned for me to follow him up the trail. It was a pretty steep climb up the side of the hill, with plenty of sand and rocks to send anyone not being careful straight back down. It felt as though the trees were closing tighter and tighter on us, until we reached a large opening at the top. Besides the empty soda bottles and used condoms, the only man-made thing in that area that I could see were long stretches of telephone poles, going across a series of sandy, dry hills. If not for the 2 strips of heavy forest on either side of these hills, it might have gone on forever. The area didn't seem to have any particular importance. I had expected him to bring me to some awful cemetery, but in the dying light of the late afternoon sky, those rolling hills just looked beautiful. I thought that he might try some desperate last attempt to scare me, but instead, he just turned to me with the most serious and grim face I'd ever seen on him. "Here we are, Hanging Man Hill," he whispered. "Hanging Man Hill, is this another one of your stories?" "Sort of, except this one's true." I rolled my eyes at the thought. How did he possibly expect me to believe any of his dumbass stories? He just kept staring at me with that face, waiting for me to respond. How could this even be a Hanging Man Hill? I don't see a hanging man, and there's at least 6 hills here. Right down there, look. He pointed his finger toward the nearest telephone pole, sitting between the 2 closest hills to us. A small creek, no more than 5 feet across. We ran between the 2 hills and went onward into that never-ending forest. There was no hanging man, but the pole itself seemed more ominous than the rest. "Roy Terrence," he whispered. "Who?" "It wouldn't be Hanging Man Hill without a hanging man, would it?" He bolted down the first hill on that blazing orange bike of his. I tried to keep up, but Walmart and sporting goods don't seem to mix. There was a faulty chain on my cheap, dull red bike. The sticks from the surrounding trees had rooted themselves to the ground and were now snagging onto the dangling chain. With one mighty tug of a huge root on the bike, I was head over handlebars all the way to the bottom. I landed on my knees, with a small sploosh sound as my legs hit the water. It couldn't have been more than a few inches deep. I almost called for help from Terry when I realized that he had stopped at the bottom, just before I had tumbled to the creek alongside him. His head was peering upwards, looking straight at the top of that dark and shadowy telephone pole. "Little help," I squeaked. Terry broke his gaze with the pole just long enough to wrench me from the creek and get me to my feet. After that, his stare continued to be fixed on seemingly nothing at the top of the pole for the longest time. "What is it? Or who is it that you're looking for again?" I grumbled in frustration. I was going to be pretty pissed off if he had taken me down here and all I had gotten out of the trip was a banged-up knee. I hadn't noticed the pain before because the water in the stream was cold, but now it stung like a bitch. "Roy Terrence, owner of that small shed just beyond the trees over there."